Hi everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Coding Squads. So this week we're going to be going through functions in a bit more detail. So specifically we're going to be looking at how you can break down your code into functions to make it a lot nicer to read and concise, and making your code adaptable. And we'll talk a bit about exactly why this is so important. So we're going to go through an example task and look at how that code would look like if we didn't use functions, if we just wrote out in a really long-winded way. And then let's see how we can sort of break that down into a function, and see how much nicer that code looks like. And then we'll talk a bit about generally why you want to use functions, why you want to use reusable components in general, the benefits of that. And if we've got time, we will also look at random numbers as well, generating random numbers in Python. And we're going to bring all that together with everything we've been through in previous weeks as well in a small task that I will give probably either the end of this lesson or the start of next, depending on how far we get. Okay, right, I need to share my screen. Okay, here we go. Right, so the task that we're going to go through this week. So basically we're going to take a number as an input, and then we're going to print the first 10 multiples of that number. So as an example, if I was to input 5, you would obviously print 5, 10, 15, and so on, all the way up until 50. And then we also want to print the 91st to 100th multiples in that number. So what we do there is we do 5 times 91, 5 times 92, and so on until we print 5 times 100. And then we want to print the 991st multiples to the 1000th multiples. So 5 times 991, 5 times 992, all the way up to 5 times 1000. Now, last week we went through loops. We looked at for loops and we looked at while loops. So obviously we know that we don't have to just do this. This would be the most inefficient way of doing this. So we'd say, firstly we'll take the input. Let's just say number equals input, enter a number, and this will be an integer, so we'll put int around it to say we're expecting an integer. So we get that input. Now we can do print number times 1, print number times 2, print number times 3, etc. But obviously, as we've seen last week, that would be very inefficient. And what we went through last week is a much better solution, and that is to use a loop. So what we can do instead is we can either use a for or a while loop. Now, if you recall last week, we said that we can use a for loop when the number of iterations is known, and we can use a while loop for basically anything else. We can use a while loop for anything. But when the number of iterations is known, like in this case, because we know the number of iterations is going to be 10, that's nice and simple. We can use a for loop to create the sort of simplest solution. So we can do for I in range 10, and this will basically start I at 0 and increment it by 1 every time, and we don't need to do anything else. Whereas if we have a while loop, let's say we start I at 0, we did while I is less than 10, and then some code here, and then we'd have to put I equals I plus 1. So both these solutions work for doing a for loop from 1 to 10. Actually, I think you want to do I equals 1 there. However, the for loop is a lot quicker to write because it automatically starts I at 0, automatically increments I by 1. So it's a little bit nicer to write. So that's why generally when the number of iterations is known, I'd use a for loop. Okay. Should say as well, if anyone... okay, yes, okay. Seen your question there. Right, so I think you might need to give a bit more context, Mohammed. I will come back to that a bit later on. If you've got any questions related to what we're doing right now, then that's good to go through. But with sort of more general Python questions, we can have a discussion about that in the Q&A at the end. So yeah, if you do have any questions specific to this, feel free to get them in the chat. Okay, so as I was saying, we'll use this for loop, and I'll just comment out this while loop here. So we can make this simple and just say print number times I, and we'll need to also make sure that we add 1 to I, so that I will essentially start at 1, because this for loop will initialize I to 0. So this will print number times 1, number times 2, number times 3, etc. And if we just run this now, let's make sure this works. So we'll do 5, and you can see numbers 5 to 50. Okay. So are you asking about, Mohammed, are you asking about multiplying by 1, by 2, by 3, and so on and so on? So you're doing multiples of 10 there. Yeah, so it will work with any number the user picks there. Because on line 15, I put print number times I. So whatever the user enters as number on line 7, that will be what's used in the for loop. Does that answer your question? How do you display the calculation? So if you wanted to display exactly what is happening to generate the multiple, we could do something like this. So we could print number and then times by I, and we'd have to convert the number to a string and I to a string as well. So if we run that again, we can see 5 times 1, 5 times 2, 5 times 3, etc., etc. So this now prints the calculation we're doing, and then below it prints the answer. So the reason I put str around number around I are because they are integers. So to be able to print them as one string, we need to first convert them to strings, and then we basically merge those three parts together. So number the asterisk meaning multiply, and I. And they're merged into one string and printed out, as you can see there. Okay. Does that make sense, or are you meaning something slightly different? Cool. Okay. And yeah, if anyone else has any questions, just get them in the chat. I may not answer them immediately because I'm just checking the chat every so often. Yeah, I'm at Lancaster University. I'm just finishing this year. So I'm doing a degree in software engineering. Okay. Anyway, so getting back to what we were talking about before. So we printed the first 10 multiples there. Now I want to do something a bit more difficult. We want to print the 91st or 100th multiples of that number. And we know with a for loop we can do that. It's a little bit more challenging though. So we need to start at 91, we need to end at 100. So there's a few different ways we can do this, but let's look at using a while loop because I think this is probably the most intuitive way of doing it. So let's say we start let's use count. We start that at 91 and we're basically going to have a while loop that says while count is less than or equal to 100. So we want to go onto 100 and we just do print number times count. Don't know why there's an extra bracket there. And we'd add one to count every time. Okay, so let's comment this out. We should see the 91st or 100th multiples being printed now. Let's do 5. And we can see that there, yeah. Okay. And we can do the same for 991 and 1000 as well. But what you hopefully can notice here, as I copy and paste this code, it's very, very similar. So all I'm doing here is I'm changing count to 991. I'm changing this limit to 1000. And that's all I'm doing. And you can see that works there. So what we've got here is some repeated code that we could put into a function. So you might have a program where you have to do a lot of different ranges and multiples potentially. Or maybe you have a few programs that do this same sorts of thing. Now, it would be very inefficient to write out this loop every single time, this block of code for every range and multiples. So instead, this is the perfect thing to put in a function. Okay. Now, just to do a quick recap on defining functions. Let's say we have a function called let's have add, and it has two parameters, num1 and num2. How would we define this function in Python? Does anyone know? And yeah, Mohammed, you can do that as well. I'm just writing out in full to make it as readable as possible, just in case anyone hasn't come across that syntax before, just to make it as clear as possible. Yeah, so that would be the first part. You'd have def for define, and then instead of function there, you'd have the function name. So you'd have def and then add, and then there's something else afterwards because remember we have two parameters called num1 and num2. Where do we define them? Yeah, that's fine. Okay, if everyone's a bit unsure, I'll go through this as an example. So, as Mohammed said, we have def and then we have add, the name of the function, and then we have these brackets here. And inside these brackets, you have your parameters. So we have num1, and we separate them both with a comma. And then at the end, we'd have a colon, and then inside that, we'd indent, and then we can write our code. So it'd be like return num1 plus num2. Okay, so here we're going to have a function that basically prints a set number of multiples. So it should work for any number and printing whatever range of multiples. Could be like print the 87th multiple to 505th multiple or something. It should work with anything like that. So what variables do we have here? If you know, put it in the chat. So think about what changes between all the loops. Yes, we got count. So I more mean look at the loops, each of the loops. Think about what's changing and what stays the same. Yeah. So the numbers we use. So like, um, yeah. So like the limit as well. Yeah. So we've got the number count starts at, and the number count increases until. Um, those are the two things really, and obviously we have the number itself. So that's three things there. So we have like start, just write that here. We have end, and we have number, which is already defined. Those were our three variables. So just make a bit of space down here. We're going to define a function. Let's call it multiples. It's going to have these three parameters. So we can define them like this: start, end, and number. Okay. And then inside of this, what code will we have? I'll give you a few minutes to have a think about that, and if you, it's useful to have a code editor handy to write this. So if you have Repellent open or you have your own code editor, feel free to write some code out on that. And if you think you know, you can put it in the chat, and we'll check it. So what code would go inside this function? Yes, I can, yeah. So it prints all the multiples of number from multiple start to multiple end. You can see examples of this above, where start was like 91, end was 100, start was 991, end was 1000. Okay, I'll give you another minute or so. Okay, yeah, that's most of it there. I think there's a couple of things missing. Okay, so let me just copy this. So yeah, you're right to say that you're going to input the start. You don't have to. You can sort of just set it in the code. We'll come on to that in a minute. But if you do take them as inputs, then you can do this for end as well. Let's move that down there to be a bit more readable. Okay. And then you said about the while loop as well. Yeah. Okay. So we've got number equals input, yeah, from range, the okay. I think what you've done there, it's maybe a little bit complicated. I'm not quite sure. What I'd suggest to do with this problem is use a while loop. So you can do it with a find range loop because there are some extra parameters in that function. So it is possible to do with that. But I think for now, let's just look at using a while loop. So you said Mohammed is about having while count is less than end, and we'll have count essentially starting at start. Yeah. So while count is less than or equal to end, I think it should be. Inside of that, we're going to basically have the code we had before. So we're going to have print number times count, and then count equals count plus 1. Okay. Now to call this function, if we move this down here, we can do this. Do multiples, then start, end, number, and this will use our inputs to run this function. So it starts count at what we say to start at, continues until count is bigger than end. It prints number times count. It adds 1 to count. Okay, and let's run this. So let's do it with, yeah, so if we do 5 and we say we're going to go from the 10th multiple up until the 20th, you can see that works fine. So the great thing about this is that just this small block of code, this will work with any of these configurations. Any start, any end, any number. So yeah, so we can see this is a lot nicer than writing a separate loop out for every configuration. And it's also great because you can use functions, again, in other programs. You can use functions that other people have written as well. So let's say you've got a few different programs, and in each of these programs you need a function like this. Instead of writing these loops out over and over in these different programs, you can save this function as a reusable component, and then you can reuse it in other programs, and it's ready to go. It's already been tested. As long as you've tested it properly, hopefully you've put some comments on it saying like what it does, and then it's ready to go. Just put it in your program, run it, call it, and it's done. Nice and easy. So you might also have to adapt this function for certain scenarios, because you're not always going to print like the 91st or 100th multiple. You might have a problem where you want to print the 10th, the 20th, the 40th, the 80th, or something like that. So where the sequence, say, like doubles each time in terms of what multiple you're printing. You could have something like this. And for that, you have two options. You can either adapt the function you have and add an extra parameter, or you can create a new function. So it'll essentially be the same function, but with different number of parameters. So for this scenario, when the multiple we're printing is essentially, it's doubling every time. So we're printing the 10th multiple, the 20th, the 40th. How do we change this code here? So just remember, the function should print the 10th, 20th, 40th, and let's just say 80th multiples. Okay, I'll give you a minute to think about that, and if you're not sure, then we'll have a look through it. Yeah, that's fine. So I'm giving quite a challenging task here. So this is more of an extension, really. So obviously what we've got at the moment is we're incrementing by 1 the number of multiples. We should have actually, I think before this, should probably look at when it increases by a set amount rather than doubling. We'll do that first because that's a bit simpler. So for that, we could say, we could add an extra parameter called like increase. And then instead of increasing by 1, we increase by increase. So we just add an extra input. Increase equals int input, and then enter the increase value, and then we do multiples, and then add on this. So this function will now cope with those scenarios where the increase is not necessarily 1. It could be 10, could be 20, etc. And the thing I originally put, where the function has to print tenth, 20th, 40th, and 80th. That's quite a challenging one, to be fair. So I probably should have started with this. But anyway, so this one, I'll just copy this again. So we basically want increase our increase value. So if increase starts at 10, then we can see here it's doubling every time. It's 10 here, then it's 20, then it's 40. So I'm trying to think of a suitable variable name here. Because you could call it increase of increase, but that's not a very good choice. Let's call this rate of increase. And let's say we put our rate of increase as 2. So we'll just put it there. So we don't need to take an input for every value. We can just specify it explicitly. So if our rate of increase is 2, our increase is 10, what line of code would we have to add to this while loop to make this work for the 10th, 20th, 40th, and 80th? This is the last thing we're going through, so don't worry if it's going over your head a little bit. Okay, I think I'll just go through this now then, because we haven't got too long left. So what we would add here, because we want to increase, multiply increase by 2 each time, we would just do increase equals increase times by rate of increase. So let's just take stock of what we've gone through there, because I did go quite fast towards the end. So let's just comment these out. So we started off with just a function that went from a start point and printed that multiple and then incremented by 1 every time. So printing like 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th multiples up until the end of a certain number. So that was fairly straightforward, fairly concise. This next function had an extra parameter called increase, and that allowed us to change what we increased our multiple by. So we might print the 10th, the 20th, 30th, and 40th, so we're increasing by 10 every time in terms of the multiple we're printing. And then we took this a step further by saying we might not necessarily have a linear increase in multiples. So it might not just be add 10 every time, it could be adding 10 and then 20 and then 40. So a number that is multiplied by another number every time. And for this, we added a final parameter called rate of increase, and we multiplied increase by rate of increase to allow us to change how much we increase by from 10 to 20 to 40 and 80 and so on. But yeah, don't worry if this is confusing you a little bit. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in chat, but this is probably taking taking stuff a bit far, just to illustrate how we need to why we need to write functions so that we can adapt them easily to different situations. So it's all about writing adaptable functions. Okay, yeah, Mohammed, with the rate of increase variable, so you can ask for this as an input as well if you want. I should probably run this as well just to illustrate this working. So this will still work here. Let me just show you. We'll do this. And we'll have the increase value of 3. So this still works even if we don't ask for an input. So you can see here that I've increased it by, increase value is 3, and then we're timesing by 2. Yeah, so it's adding 15, and it's adding 30, and then it's adding 60, so it creates this sequence here, 120. So even though we don't ask for it as an input, it still works because we're specifying it's 2 here, and it's always 2. But if we wanted to, we could have an input. So we could do, just copy that again. We could do rate of increase here, enter the rate of increase value. That would also work. But it's important to remember that when we pass values in here, they now exist there. Now, when I refer to start, I'm not referring to this. I'm referring to whatever was passed in here. So I could just say disregard whatever the user's inputted and start at 0 every time. And regardless of what we enter as start here, as we're passing in 0 here, start will be 0. Does that make a bit more sense? Does that explain what you were confused on? Okay, that's good. Does anyone else have any questions? And I'll happily answer any general Python questions. So Mohammed, earlier you said about what 2F was. So I think you're talking about printing with formatting, or either that, or you were talking about rounding up to 2 decimal places when you're printing. So yeah, it's sort of hard to say without context. Okay, so you said about best websites for learn coding. So in terms of websites I recommend to my students, so one I came across the other day was Codecademy, and this has a load of I think free online courses, which are quite good. Another one that I recommend is called LeetCode. Now this is maybe a bit difficult as a beginner because a lot of the problems on there are quite advanced, but certainly once you've got a bit of experience, which hopefully after this course and after practicing elsewhere you hopefully will have, you can try some of the easy problems on LeetCode, and you can practice loads of different things. You can learn loads about different data structures and different problems, and that is a really useful site. And it's really useful as you sort of progress as well. You don't get to a point with LeetCode that the problems are too easy for you. It will never stop challenging you. So LeetCode is really good. So yeah, I mean, generally, I think I will go through this in a future course. But there are so many resources, future lesson, I mean, so many resources online for learning about coding. Um, so generally, what I'd recommend to learn about to help you learn is using tutorials. So these are obviously quite good for that, and other tutorials on YouTube as well. Um, and trying to follow them. And when you're confident enough trying your own project, try and keep it fairly simple, and use the internet um, to be able to help with your issues. Use AI as well, not to write your code, but just to maybe help you with like identifying what the correct syntax is. Um, so I will go through this in more detail as well. I know you could just write simple programs using ChatGPT, but I try and avoid doing that. I'd use AI as sort of a more efficient search tool, kind of like you use Google when you have a problem when you don't know how something works, but don't don't do it so that you never think about a problem you're having with your code again. Use it so that you can quickly find out how do you do a certain thing. So rather than spending half an hour on Google, you can now put the specific problem in on ChatGPT, and it will give you a detailed solution. You can interact with that solution, ask follow-up questions. Make sure you have your own understanding before actually using that code. Um, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think I know what you mean, Mohammed. So yeah, I think that will be sort of to do with your IDE. It's a bit annoying, really. So yeah, I generally it's just a case of copying and pasting it again, and maybe you have to like sort the indentations out in your code. So it'll be an indentation error, I think. Um, so that is just something to do with your IDE, and when you copy and paste someone else's code, and maybe they've got indented slightly differently, then you may have an issue there. Um, Okay, I will have to go now, but I'll be back same time next week. So we will do a quick recap of functions again. We'll also look at random numbers, and I've also got a small task that we can go through as well to sort of bring together all the knowledge. Um, Next lesson is Friday at 5:30 again, so they're Friday 5:30 every week. So hope to see you all there. Thanks to everyone who contributed in the lesson. It's really appreciated. Hope to see you all next week. All right. See you all. Bye.